fish oil and fish meal, which are made from wild fish called foraged fish. So they're these kind of small fish. I'll describe them in a bit more detail later on. The reason that there's quite a lot of fish oil that goes to salmon is because it's high in omega-3, and salmon producers want to be able to market salmon as a product that's high in omega-3. And as we already mentioned, that 90% of this fish that's going into fish meal and fish oil is food grade or prime grade food grade fish, so it could be eaten by people. There's also, similar to the issue with, say, industrial agriculture, there's a lot of plant ingredients that goes into salmon as well, so like soya and rapeseed. So some of that stuff could also be eaten by us. So forage fish, they're things like, so someone mentioned anchovies in the chat. I also love anchovies. Stuff like sprat, sardinella, herring, blue whiting. So not only are they things that we could be eating, they're also prey for larger fish, so they play quite a big part in marine ecosystems. And experts recommend that we take a really precautionary approach to how we fish them. So then how much wild fish goes into Scottish salmon? So for our project, we took Scottish salmon as a case study. It would vary a bit depending on what industries across the globe. They tend to use slightly more marine ingredients in salmon, so they can market it as being higher in Scotland, so they can market it as being higher in omega-3. So yeah, as I said earlier, it's 460,000 tons, and that's roughly equivalent to the amount of seafood bought by the UK population. So then what we set out to question in our research, because what we hear a lot from industry is that this is an efficient way of using these forage fish to create salmon to provide micronutrients for a global population. So we wanted to consider, is it efficient to feed these small fish to salmon and then eat the salmon? Or would it be better if we, say, ate those fish directly ourselves and ate less salmon? That's what we started to explore. So we created 3 different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we just assumed that everything would stay the same. So it's just business as usual. So we take this 460,000 tons of wild fish, we make fish oil and fish meal, and we produce farmed salmon. And to note that when you make fish oil, you also, as a byproduct, create some fish meal, but salmon is fed more fish oil than fish meal, so there's some fish meal left over. So for our calculations, we just assumed that none of that was wasted and they were really efficient and they fed all the leftover fish meal to prawns. So we've assumed that none of it's been wasted. So this is kind of what it looks like when you map it out. So it's 460,000 tons of whole fish. The industry average is to use about 1/3 of byproducts, so like trimmings, so like fish heads or fish tails. So we factored that in as well. We factored in stuff like wheat and soya and peas all going. So it gives you about 180,000 tons of salmon and 400,000 tons of prawns. That works out at the UK population at like 1 portion of salmon a week and 2 portions of prawns. Yeah, so they've got that there. And that would meet the NHS guidelines for here as well, for how much omega-3 fatty acids we need. So it looks like this. You just get salmon and you just get prawns and you have a really large amount of wild fish going in to create this. So then we wanted to see what would happen if we just used byproducts to feed salmon. So if we said that salmon can't use any whole wild-caught fish, it can only use these leftover byproducts. So this, probably unsurprisingly, would then lead to scaled down salmon production. So it would just be 1/3 of its current size based on the current amount of byproducts available. So it would look more like this. So we would take the byproducts, and then we only need to take 40% of the fish that we were previously feeding to salmon to eat for ourselves. So that means we get to leave 60% of fish in the sea. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little complicated, but I'll leave the screen up for a second so you can look at it. And how we did that is we calculated with a nutritionist how to get this plate at the end, how that would have basically the same nutritional profile as just the salmon and the prawns. And then from that, we could say, oh, we don't actually need all the fish we are giving to the salmon. We just need this 40%. And we also, because we've got a scaled down salmon production, we have some of the plant ingredients, because we don't need to give as much plant ingredients to salmon anymore either. So, so we can either keep some of that in the ground, like not chop down as much of the rainforest, and we also have some of that on our plate as well. So as the box says there, it contains as much omega-3 as the business as usual, and actually more vitamin B12, calcium, iron, selenium, zinc, and vitamin A. So yeah. So basically, as I said, to get a similar nutrient profile to business as usual, we just need to consume 41% of the forage fish. And yes, we have liberated some plant proteins, which we can either eat directly or leave in the ground. So scenario B looks a bit more like this. We have a much bigger variety of fish that we're eating. So we still have a little salmon and a little prawns, but we could have stuff like herring and anchovies and more plant ingredients. Whereas in scenario A looks boring like this, just salmon and prawns. So then we created a third scenario where we wanted to explore the potential of unfed aquaculture. So unfed aquaculture is things like mussels that don't need external feed input, so you don't need to feed them anything. So basically for this, we just did the exact same as the last scenario, but we assumed everyone would eat one portion of mussels a week as well. And then what that does is, because you get quite a lot of nutrients from the mussels, it means you can now leave 77% of the wild fish in the sea. So it looks just a little bit like this. It's basically the same, but there's more wild fish that get left in the sea. Because yeah, it's interesting to note, it says it on the graph here, that only 3% of global mussel production potential is being used. So that's something we think maybe there's a bit more opportunity to scale up. But obviously, like anything, you don't want it to become too big, because there's issues when anything becomes too big. So yeah, again, here you have the same kind of thing, and on the plate at the end, it's very similar to the one in scenario B, but we also get some mussels. And we also get we have the same omega-3, vitamin B12, and all of those things. So scenario C just looks like this, with some tasty mussels added in at the side. I'm a big fan of mussels. I don't know about you guys. So this is quite, just to look more in detail if people are interested about how we calculated the different nutritional stuff. So they're all shown there in the different colors. So business as usual is the light blue. Scenario B, which is just using the byproducts, is the dark blue, and then the purple is scenario C. So there's a couple of cases where you get way more. So for instance, for vitamin B12, you get a lot more in scenario C. For omega-3, they're roughly kind of all the same. They're the last two columns. And then there's some like vitamin D, we are getting less. But from speaking to some nutritionists, they have said you can get a lot of that from supplements. But yeah, but we can also, where you could kind of tweak the model. If you said, I want to get more vitamin D, you could probably add in some more fish, you know, from one or two. So that would work as well. But we were mainly focused on the omega-3 because that's the main thing that you can specifically get from, say, marine ingredients, and that we kind of hear from the industry when we talk to them. So I just wanted to mention, we talked a little bit about mortalities at the top, because basically what our kind of research shows is that this is an inefficient way of using these forage fish to feed salmon. But another way that the salmon industry in Scotland is wasteful is also in the high level of mortalities. So as we said earlier, there's a 14% mortality rate in 2019. And that's compared to, in the UK, you have a thing called a red tractor scheme, which is quite the lowest level of certification. And for that, you can only have a maximum of 5% mortality rate. So it's a lot higher than that. And obviously salmon is alive for a lot longer. It takes a lot longer to grow it. but there's still clearly some issues that they can't really get the mortality rate down. And as I mentioned earlier as well, it's important to think that this isn't just the salmon that's dying, it's all the wild fish that have to die to go to that salmon. So we calculated that that in 2019, the mortalities represented about 25,000 tons of wild fish going to waste. And that would have been enough to feed 2 million people their weekly portion of oily fish for a year. So that's obviously quite a lot as well. So then this is the question we get always from industry when we talk to them. Industry actually use this term for forage fish. They call it low consumer preference fish, so this question that like no one will, that's fine, but no one's going to eat herring and anchovies. But there are some examples. So Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who's kind of a celebrity chef here, he had a show here called Hugh's Fish Fight. And after that was on, and he promoted eating mackerel, it went up by 14% in the months thereafter. And what I find particularly interesting is salmon itself is an example of a fish that has a lot of increased consumption because of marketing. So for instance, in the UK, there's been a 550% increase in salmon consumption over the last 50 years. And people think that's mainly down to this kind of marketing of it as being like this clean fish with a lot of omega-3. And then obviously in the slow food arc of taste as well, there's a lot of examples of things like, I was looking, there's like carrageen moss from Ireland, which is a seaweed that would give you some of those nutrients. There's, I think it was kejak dried fish from Senegal. So there's a lot of things that we've kind of historically eaten that maybe we don't eat anymore, but there's no reason we couldn't. I don't know if anyone they want to put in the chat if there's any examples of a fish that they know that used to be eaten a lot and isn't anymore. I was really surprised when I was researching this that monkfish apparently used to be really cheap because people thought it was ugly. And I was like, I would really love it if monkfish was cheap now. It's obviously quite expensive now. So to sum up then our findings from that research, it's that farmed salmon fed on wild fish is an inefficient and environmentally poor way to produce micronutrients for human diets. If instead we shifted to consuming a variety of small, oily, wild-caught fish and had one portion of mussels, while still eating a small amount of farmed salmon, we could get the same nutrients and keep 77% of that wild fish in the sea. Then I just wanted to highlight, this was another thing we looked at in the report. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat to see. Throw the monkfish back. God, that's crazy. We can discuss that after. This idea kind of about like fish for whom and access to nutrition. I found when I talk to industry that they sometimes they think of it in a very kind of scientific way of they'll say, oh, this is the most efficient way. And firstly, we've shown that it's actually not the most efficient way. But also, if you're taking a global food security perspective, you have to also consider who gets to eat that fish. So if you take forage fish from somewhere like Africa, and then you use it to feed salmon in Scotland, that is mainly an export product going to like America and France for people who don't necessarily need those nutrients, then that's still a waste of resources. So on equal access to nutrition, there's been some really good papers recently talking about, there's a really good, I can send it around after, it's from a person called Christina Hicks in Nature, where she looks at if countries just used their own local fish for nutrition and that stuff, like there is enough if they consumed like a really small amount of local fish to help with nutrient deficiencies, but most of it goes for export. And also, I don't know if people have come across the Seas Around Us project. They also recently came out with a paper where they argued that fish should be seen as a public health asset. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it as well. Because at the moment, Scottish salmon is, it's a commodity that goes into the food supply chain. And the example in the picture there as well is like how it's marketed in Japan. So it's marketed as like tartan salmon. So it's kind of, it's not, it's just this global commodity that is reliant on wild fish from across the world. So just in short, to conclude then, that we kind of found that, you often get asked this, like, is there enough fish? Can we eat it? That we can eat a sustainable fish diet, but it has to be, you have to consume like a big variety of fish. And also that it's important to question your assumptions. So how do we make the best use of micronutrients and the food we choose to eat? But like I said earlier, I think we get caught sometimes in this thinking of like, should we eat fish or not? Where it's maybe what type of fish should we eat and who gets to eat it? And we need to explore those in more detail. There is obviously more recommendations that go into detail in the reports. So I think I will stop there. If anyone has questions or anything they want me to clarify, I can go back over the slides if there's anything. Sorry, I'm trying to get the chat. It's weird. Here we go. Oh, is this okay? Someone's given an example. Oh, that Paula. Do you want to mention, Paula, the one that you put in the chat from the Ark of Taste?
Yeah, I just shared in the chat the link to the Slow Food Ark of Taste with the category of fish and seafood products, where people can see the different products. But I don't like the word product, but let's say the different foods that are related to seafood in the different countries, and that could make an idea to inspire people to eat fish in a different way. So yes.
Yeah, and I see someone mentioned that they're from Mussel. They live in Belgium. My colleague Karen, who worked on the calculations with me, is from Belgium. So she also really likes mussels and is keen for people here to eat more. Another example someone gave is sablefish. I hope I said that right. Pacific black cod. It was one of the most inexpensive species, and now it's the most expensive next to bluefish tuna. I think, yeah, so I think the indication certification, it can be given to Scottish farmed salmon. And Scottish farmed salmon is actually the only, it also has the label rouge, which is like a French mark of quality. It's like the only farmed fish to have that. But what's interesting about that is that it requires a minimum of marine ingredients. So it actually needs more wild fish because they see it as a mark of quality. So there is also soya to answer Lawrence's question, there is soya in the Scottish one as well. It varies per country and it does vary per company as well. They do tend to use more fish meal and fish oil in Scotland because they see it as a marketing thing, that they can say there's more, like a higher marine ingredient in it. So yeah, it does vary, but 70% soy does seem high, but around 15% forage fish for Norway probably is about right, I would say. But yeah, it does definitely vary. So across countries. And it's interesting when you talk to them, it's like they have a very differentiated approach for each country, kind of because they know like some countries will accept something, the consumers will or won't. And yeah, Paul, I don't know if I can make it so that everyone can talk. Do you hear what? So we didn't in this model particularly look at protein as well, because we looked more at micronutrients. Just because there's lots of studies that show that we can get a lot of protein from plant proteins. So we figured that we need more to focus on fish for marine, for like the marine things like omega-3. There is a study, I'll make a note to send it in the notes, from Fry et al. That looks at protein. And I think it's like for every 100 grams of protein that goes in, you only get 28 grams out. But I need to double check it. But I'll write a note to myself to send that round to everyone, because yeah, for Fry et al. paper. Yes, I will go back to them 1 second. Yeah, Paul, you said you had some questions. I don't know if you want to type them in the chat or. Oh, okay. Read out the questions aloud. Um, yes. So the question that I was mentioning earlier was, do you have a figure for what percentage of forage fish protein is lost when it's used to produce salmon? And I was saying that for this, we didn't specifically look at protein because there's been a lot of research showing that we can get the protein we need from plant ingredients. So that's why we specifically looked at things more like omega-3. But that, as far as I'm aware, there is this paper from Fry et al., which I can send around, that I think it showed 100 grams of protein goes in and you only get 28 grams out. Yes, the reports are, someone's asked if the reports are on the website. They are, but I can send a link to them around as well. And I'll also send a link around to the PowerPoint, which someone else has asked. So yeah, I don't know if people have other questions or even just other thoughts, like do people eat farmed salmon or... Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So someone, sorry, has asked, why do you think that salmon, despite the environmental damage they produce, is still among the cheap fishes? I guess it's quite a lot of it is produced. It is also quite popular, and supermarkets market it quite a lot here. I don't know what it's like everywhere else, but here it's probably one of the most... we did a little investigation at the start of summer where I went to a lot of supermarkets, and salmon is always kind of like in the middle shelf. There's always offers on it, so it gets promoted that way a lot. But I think as well, the reality is that the cost we pay for food just isn't representative of the environmental damage. So the same is true for a lot of cheap meat. Unfortunately, I guess that needs to change. So someone says, what are easy substitutes for salmon? So I think some of the stuff we have like mentioned, that I guess it depends, like obviously anchovies is not the same texture or something as salmon, but I think it's trying to just diversify the fish you eat. I don't know if anyone has found something that they think is a more direct substitute. I haven't really come across, but I think if you just eat a bigger variety of fish. Sorry. So someone has asked, what could governments do to make poor fish more trendy? You do not often find alternatives on the shelves. Yeah, so we, in working with supermarkets, have asked them to provide more things on the shelves. It's interesting. I know for the UK, people eat fish more out in restaurants than they cook it at home. That obviously may change now with lockdown and things. So we have worked with some chefs because we see them then as having quite a big role in shaping what people eat. Because if people go to a restaurant and maybe try something, then they might be more keen to try it at home. So someone's asked, is there any land-based salmon production in Scotland? Have you looked at the land-based salmon production? There isn't, as far as I'm aware, at the moment in Scotland. The reason we haven't looked at that much because it doesn't really address the feed issue. So for people who aren't aware, land-based would be, obviously it wouldn't be like in this picture in the nets in the sea. It's more in like a container on land. And some people think that is good then, so there's less environmental damage to the local area that the farms would have been in. But I guess from our perspective, you still require the same amount of feed, really. So it doesn't solve that issue. So I'm reading out Morgan's question. Do you think it's counterproductive to ship fish across the world after it's been sourced sustainably? I'm in the US and only try to buy fresh caught fish, but it's sticky. Yeah, it is a tough one. I think there's probably a room for both. So like, I always think that my kind of advice on what fish to eat would vary based on where you're from. So if I was back living in Ireland by the sea, I would probably just try catch my own fish and eat that local fish. Obviously, if you're not living somewhere with direct access to that, it can be a bit different. I think stuff as well, like some you know, forage fish like anchovies, they're easier to preserve and things. So then transporting them and they have a longer shelf life is maybe more accessible. But I think it's how much of that. I think we have to view it as for those of us who have more like privilege, I guess, in the supply chain, that we don't take more than we need and we're ensuring there's enough left for everyone else. So Paul has said forage fish are often caught by large high-tech vessels operating in the global south. So those fish are being stolen out of the mouths of people who do have a consumer preference. So do we want to promote eating fish caught ashore developing country where people? Do we want to promote eating fish off the shores of developing countries? Yeah, so I think that's linked to back what I was saying, that firstly, some of these fish, like you do actually get herring and stuff off the UK. So it would be that we could eat some of those fish as well. But also that we wouldn't take more, that we shouldn't be taking more than we need. And where possible, trying to source it more locally ourselves. And also that like this is, you know, a model we used, but you could put in, and we just use the type of forage fish that are commonly used by the aquaculture industry, but you could, you know, create a model for your local food system and put in different fish and probably get a similar result. So it's, but this is obviously just one example. Maybe that stat is for salmon then as opposed to wild fish. I'll check. I know it's from the FAO, so I will double check that one. Thanks, Paula, for sharing that. Yeah, so we have about 5-ish minutes left. I don't know if anyone has any more questions, or let me see. I don't know if I can make it so that everyone else can talk, if anyone wants to add any comments or anything. I will save the chat as well, so I will try answer anything. Okay, I'm gonna let everyone talk if anyone wants to add anything for the last few minutes.
Yeah, actually we are a reduced number, so it will be kind of easy to have an open conversation. Well, there is a question, Christina. Is most of the soy Brazilian? Have you looked at pesticides in the soy? Do you have any answer for that?
We didn't look at pesticides in the soy. I think on it being Brazilian, it varies a lot. So most, for instance, for Scotland, they will say it's only certified soya, but there might be a company that operates globally and say in Chile, they might not be using certified soya. But because the demand in Scotland is different. And we also argue in one of the reports that there's sort of, obviously there's like a limited amount of both things like soya and sustainable fish. So even if you are taking in terms sustainable soya, then you're still overall decreasing the availability of that for everyone, if that makes sense. So it's like there's a limited amount of sustainable soya. So even if what you're taking is sustainable, but then you're still removing that from the global food supply to feed fish. So someone has asked, is eating wild salmon better? Well, as I said, you can't now get Scottish wild salmon. I think if you are somewhere where you can, I think someone actually mentioned that they sell wild salmon, so they might want to chip in. That I think, yeah, if you can get wild salmon, again, you would be eating it not that often, but that you're at least it's not reliant on, it's eating some fish itself in the wild, but not fish that has been taken from, you know, across the world and shipped over. Someone has asked, what other NGOs do you work with? In Scotland, we've worked with the Scotland and the Salmon and Trout Conservation Trust, the Coastal Communities Network. I'm trying to think, there's loads more, because there's a lot in Scotland, but a lot of them are focused on the damage being done in their local environment, because obviously that's what they're seeing firsthand. Paul has raised their hand. I don't know if you want to say something. Let me see if I have unmuted you. Oh, sorry. You should be able to talk now, Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, just to throw something else in the mix from Peter Tidemers, who wrote about this in the early 2000s, is that the wild salmon are eating algae and zooplankton, whereas the farm salmon, like when the wild salmon are born, they're little tiny, you know, and they're eating little tiny feed. But the farm salmon are being fed fish that would actually eat them in the wild. So you've turned the food pyramid upside down a lot of times, is when they're tiny. Do you get me?
Yeah, because it's and
Like,
it's interesting as well. I was talking to someone.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Like if you take blue whiting, you know, they're going to eat those baby salmon, right? But now they're being chopped up and fed to the baby salmon.
Yeah, because also when you talk, I was talking to someone from one of the big certification schemes, that Marine Trust certification scheme, and they were like, well, I mean, salmon eat fish in the wild, so it's fine. And I was like, yeah, but they don't eat this much wild fish, and they don't eat wild fish from a sea that is like the other side of the world. So it's kind of disingenuous.
Right, and they don't, and when they hatch out of the egg, they're eating algae. They're not eating wild fish at all.
Yeah, and you know, they're not eating. You know, it's not obviously on the scale or anything as well. So it's not the same thing. So yeah. So Johnny has just put in the chat. He's talked about Alaska wild salmon. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second, or.
Yeah, sure. This is Johnny. Do you hear me?
Yeah, well, I can hear you.
Okay. Alaska, especially in the Bering Sea, the northernmost part of the Pacific Ocean, in the north of the Gulf of Alaska, it's pretty much the only place left on Earth where we have intact habitat and where we maintain our salmon runs, and some are still growing in size every year. Pretty much the rest of Alaska is hit or miss on healthy runs, but on the average over, say a 10-year basis, a lot of those salmon runs are producing pretty well. The last few years have been some anomalies, but we always have huge problems with factory hatchery salmon releases into the North Pacific that is really impacting wild salmon.
So does that impact the wild fish then?
The hatcheries?
The farmed fish?
Well, the farm fish, definitely. I'm a wild salmon fisherman from Alaska, and 1993 was the highest price we ever got at the dock for our fish, and then farm salmon hit, and nothing's ever improved since. But the ubiquity of farm salmon, they overtook us. They matched us in 1998, and I think by 2002 or 3, farm salmon there was more production than wild production on the world. Now it's 3 times as much as farm salmon. The one thing, though, you're talking about feed sourcing and the hemispheric protein transfer. Most of the farm salmon are eating feed that's produced in the southern hemisphere, and wild salmon are not an indigenous species to the southern hemisphere.
Yeah.
Wild salmon barely survive below maybe 20 degrees northern latitude. So that's we're creating a problem. In your report you had that that farm salmon consumption was up 550% since like 1974, and the health claims are partly responsible for it, but that is not even close to just the fact that farm salmon have been ubiquitous in fish cases and in restaurants as a replacement protein, and a substitute offering for land-based terrestrial animals like beef, pork, and chicken. It's what would you when they ask you, will it be meat or fish tonight? And it used to be white fish and several other different kinds of fish. What salmon was really, really rare as an option. Now salmon is incredibly ubiquitous.
Yeah, that's definitely what we found when we were doing this investigation with supermarkets here, that it was definitely the most marketed fish. It usually was kind of on the best shelf position in terms of eyesight. There was often offers on it. And if you went on to say a supermarket's website, the recipes for fish, it was almost always salmon at the top. And like, so that it's just become super, ubiquitous. And I think a lot of people don't think beyond kind of salmon. I think also people are sometimes slightly maybe like afraid of things like anchovies because it's the whole fish, whereas when they just get the salmon fillet and they kind of know what to do with it. Paula has asked in the chat to talk about the environmental risk of salmon aquaculture, about sea lice and escapes. So yeah, there's been big issues in Scotland with sea lice on farmed salmon. And then there's been also a lot of issues with those farmed salmon escaping and then impacting the wild salmon there. So it sounds a little similar to what you're talking about in Alaska. So between, say, stuff like the sea lice and the mortality, the really high mortality rates, it does sort of suggest that the industry in its current format isn't working. But the industry in, say, Scotland still wants to grow. They want bigger farms. Or any fish recipes they recommend.
This is Johnny again. I really appreciate you putting this together, and thanks, Paula, too. Could you maybe give us an idea where feedback might be looking to address aquaculture in Scotland and worldwide? What kind of things you're looking at perhaps next? And changing tastes report in UK, Europe, and then both of your reports. We need to get all of this literature out around the planet. Maybe we could all talk about in the future about some coordinated effort to do that, that we have some great literature now. If anybody has some ideas, if anybody has some ideas about cooperation around the world on fighting industrial aquaculture and salmon feedlots, especially. But yeah, go ahead, Paul. Sorry,
Oh, sorry, I thought I was muted. I wrote a book called Swimming in Circles. There's a lot of that stuff.
Cool, amazing.
It's a great book. It's a great book.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
I'll add it to my ever-growing to read list. In terms of next to answer your question and feedback, we're currently going to do a short campaign targeting Sainsbury's, which is one of the biggest supermarkets here, and their use of wild fish in their feed supply chain. And as part of that, their main supplier is Maui, who used to be called Marine Harvest, who are like the biggest global producer of farmed salmon. We're kind of producing a short briefing looking at Maui as well, hopefully following that up with maybe then some more detailed look at the corporate structure of the farmed salmon industry. First, just looking at Scotland, and then maybe then globally. Because it's, you know, like any of these industries, there's quite a large monopoly. There's not that many companies and they control most of it. And then I think going forward, we look to maybe expand beyond Scotland. And also we are working with some academics in Lancaster University with this model to submit it, tightening it up a bit and kind of submitting it for a peer review paper. So hopefully then we can get it out more as well. Yeah, okay. I think I have to end now because I have a meeting at 3. I will send the papers that we discussed around to everyone and any of the references I mentioned as well. And then you'll have my email, so if anyone has any questions, you can email me.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. It was a very interesting webinar, at least from my point of view, I guess for the others too. And yeah, it would be great if we could keep the conversation going on. I mean, there are other rounds there are other rounds until next April, and we will be creating, let's say, knowledge and reflections on different aspects of the slow fish campaign. And I think what is happening with the aquaculture, what is happening with the wild fish stocks and the state of our oceans is something that we will come later on, but very often I'm pretty sure about that. And I think if you have recorded this webinar, that would be great to have like this video as a share material that maybe can be also spread within our network, since the time is an issue here. But yeah, it will be great to keep spreading the word and explore also further ways of collaboration.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, sorry, I kind of I was trying to pick a time, but yeah, it's hard because even I was trying to attend a webinar recently and it was Canadian time and it was like 1 a.m. for me, so I was like, I'm gonna have to give that a miss this time, but maybe next time.
Yeah, no worries, but we really appreciate your attention and your engagement with us. So thank you very much, and thank you all very much for joining this webinar.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming and all your interesting questions and comments. And yeah, well, have a good day, everyone. I hope if you're in lockdown or not, you're managing okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.